Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. When George Whitmore arrived in Paris in the late 1940s, he wasn't exactly intending to explore the city. In fact, he had come to the city almost by chance. After many years in the freelance work life, he had learned how temporary everything could be. George was bored with his jobs, tired of his relationships, and searching for direction in the next phase of his life. He believed everything was fleeting and thought that anything he once had could suddenly disappear. One morning, as he decided to wander the city, he stumbled upon Gare de Lyon. This large train station was one of the busiest places in Paris, and it immediately caught his attention. As he entered the vibrant atmosphere of the station that morning, it felt almost like he was part of a dream. Every corner was filled with a hustle and bustle. Passengers hurried to their platforms, racing against time to catch their trains. The sounds of trains, the occasional announcements, and the constant rush created a world of its own. While experiencing a sense of lostness, he noticed something. This was a place where he could watch people come and go without losing his own identity. No one would ask him questions here. He could just exist as a temporary observer, and no one would know anything about his past or who he was. In that moment, he made a decision. In this world, filled with people on every corner of the station, he could erase his trace and live without being questioned by anyone. Every day, from early morning until late at night, he could roam there, silently observing, watching the lives of others. He found a corner of the station. There, surrounded by a few old suitcases and some simple belongings, he began living. As he arranged his things, the only thing on his mind was creating some sort of order in this transient life. Slowly, Gare de Lyon began to feel like home. To him at that moment, George started to feel the peace of blending into the rhythm of the station, amidst the rushing lives, hurried footsteps, and the people quickly preparing to leave in the mornings. The entire station's rhythm began to reflect on his own life. At first, people didn't notice George. He just seemed like a faceless traveler, a man who arrived at the station with a nervous look, wearing his old coat and vanishing into the crowd. Indeed, no one asked him anything. The station was the perfect place for a person to disappear and exist without being noticed. As George gradually realized what he truly wanted to do, that corner seemed to be made just for him. While people rushed to their trains, he blended into life, setting aside his own identity, getting lost in the crowd. That corner became the place that gave George's life meaning. It was where something lost could be rediscovered. Slowly, as he became part of the station's routine, he learned the schedules of the trains. During those times, he'd retreat to his little world in the back corner, sipping tea or spending time with a magazine. Here, he could live without his identity, because no one was curious about him and no one asked questions. At first, this strange way of life felt like a weird experiment for George. But over time, this lifestyle became his own. He became familiar with the sounds of the trains, the morning rush, and the evening bustle. Gare de Lyon was no longer just a transit point. It had become a space that felt like his own, a kind of sanctuary. When George first started spending his days at Gare de Lyon, he realized how simple and odd his life had become. The station had become his new world. Those early mornings were unfamiliar and challenging. He had placed his belongings in a corner of the station, but beyond that, he had no real routine to meet his basic needs. He didn't have a bathroom or a personal space. He was just lost within the noisy, chaotic train station. For a few days, he even forgot to eat. While watching people rush to board their trains in the mornings, he had nothing on him but his old coat. But strangely, the crowd in the station gave him a sense of security. Here, no one questioned who he was. No one saw him as a beggar or a homeless man. He had become an unnoticed part of the station, an invisible figure. Passengers came and went, and as the trains departed and arrived, George retreated to his corner, waiting without realizing how time passed. The moments between the mornings, afternoons, and evenings began to feel like a rhythm he had grown used to. The sound of the trains had become a kind of melody for George. Every new train's strange noise would wake him up, and during those moments, he blended into the rhythm of life. As he sat there, a few strangers would glance at him from the corners of their eyes. Some passed by without noticing, while others gave a fleeting look, a brief glance of curiosity. However, George had come to love this conscious disappearance. He left no trace. The daily rituals of the station had become part of George's life. In the early mornings, before the city's noise had even started, passengers would get off the train. While they hurriedly pulled their suitcases and tried to leave, George would walk through the crowd and stop by a small cafe near the station to get his morning coffee. Every day, he would have a cup of coffee there, pick up a newspaper, and sit for a while in the corner. People, in their morning rush, didn't notice him. They thought he was just a traveler, a stranger, someone temporarily passing through. But George had fully adapted to the rhythm of the station. Slowly, this place had become his living space, a kind of hidden home. In the early days, he struggled with food, but over time, the shopkeepers at the station started looking out for him. Little by little, they would leave him something for breakfast. With small but consistent help, they made his temporary life more bearable. When the trains came, sometimes he could buy some bread or cheese, then return to his corner and wait a bit longer. As the days went by, the busy atmosphere of Gerda Lion became George's world. The hustle of passengers, the indecisiveness on the faces of those boarding the trains, or the hurried journeys, somehow kept him alive. He began to feel that blending into the crowd every day, merging with everyone, was a kind of freedom. The station workers had become familiar with George. Sometimes, the station manager, with his round glasses on his arms, would walk by and nod at George, occasionally even greeting him. Those mornings, the ticking of the station's great clock had become like the beat of his heart. He would sit there for hours every morning, feeling the peace of simply existing there. For George, being in the middle of the crowd had become a source of relaxation. There was nothing in his life that directed him. Yet strangely, in harmony with the rhythm of the station, he enjoyed everything. He had created his own routine. Each moment, like the passing of another passenger. He disappeared without leaving a trace. The station had erased his real identity. No trace remained of his past jobs or the life he had once lived. George was a lost stranger at the corner of Gerda Lion. Over time, waking up to the sounds of the trains, dealing with the rush at every corner, retreating back to a corner in the evening, had become a natural part of his life. This new order, reshaping his identity, had become his own. As time passed, George's presence at Gerda Lion became a part of the station. The anxious foreign figure he once was had disappeared, replaced by a more settled life. Now, the people, at every corner of the station looked at him with familiarity. George was no longer just a homeless man. His existence had become a part of the station's hidden ritual. Somehow, from helping passengers boarding the train to exchanging greetings with the station staff, he had become a natural face of the station. Every morning, when George took his place in his old corner, the world around him spun quickly. He lived his life in a slow rhythm, and every day, his routine became more defined. On the stone floors of Gerda Lion, he would sometimes exchange a few words with the cleaners or the ticket inspectors. He now enjoyed helping out in various corners of the station and providing information to passengers. People still looked at him as a stranger, but he had become a familiar figure in nearly every part of the station. One morning, a passenger, who was seeing George for the first time, suddenly asked himself, when did this man get here? It had become so familiar that while he sat in his corner, slowly observing the surroundings, no one called him a stranger. He had become a quietly accepted, invisible presence. A few weeks ago, every passenger who came to the station would glance at him and just walk by. No one knew who George was, but somehow, everyone had accepted him. His presence was part of the rhythm of Gerda Lion, just like the passing of a train, and no one questioned it as they went on with their lives. Now, George's corner, that corner in the mornings, had become a sort of sanctuary in the bustling world of the station. Conversations with passengers getting off the train had become a way for him to pass the time. He would tell them about the directions of the trains, the city, and sometimes even walking routes. George's calmness felt like a kind of guidance for the passengers. As they passed by, each one somehow noticed his peaceful presence. Sometimes a passenger would ask, "Have you been here before?" But George would always brush off these questions with a slight smile. He seemed to carry no past, nor any concerns about the future. He had become a man lost within the walls of the station, living his life at his own pace. The only thing that drew attention was that he sat in the same corner every day, in the same way. From the outside, it might have seemed like a very ordinary sight, but anyone who explored the world around him found meaning in it. He lived in harmony with the station's noise, disappearing at the corner whenever another passenger passed by, watching without touching anyone's life. George's situation had turned into a kind of inner peace. In the limited world of Gerda Lion, he had learned to live at his own slow rhythm. Among the passengers getting off the trains, the ticket inspectors, and the busy people running around, he left just a trace, disappearing without leaving anything behind. His name was unknown, his past forgotten, but every day, he left a mark. In the heart of the station, George's habits had become a part of the station's nature. The train arrival times, the waiters rushing to the coffee stands, the short conversations in the ticket lines. All of them were part of George's world. He was familiar with every detail but had never fully immersed himself in this world. People came and went, and George was always in the same place. The walls of Gerda Lion offered him years of peaceful space. Yet outside, there was a world beyond the station, and that world was not a part of George. He was simply a stranger, belonging to Gerda Lion. Over time, George's life at Gerda Lion had turned into a place of peace, where the days spent in solitude had come together. In the beginning, this solitude had felt like an emptiness. But as the years passed, this solitude had transformed into an inner balance. As George adapted to the rhythm of the station, rather than distancing himself from the outside world, He formed a silent bond with it. Every train sound, every echo of a step, every new passenger kept him connected to this world in some way. At first, passengers and station employees didn't notice his presence and seemed to ignore him, but gradually, they began to understand the complex world he had become a part of. Rather than accepting him as a stranger, they began to see him, almost like a corner in everyone's inner world, a presence that had unknowingly become part of their lives. In this process, there was both loneliness and silence, but on the other hand, it was possible to form brief, strong connections. Short conversations starting with a few words, smiles, brief greetings, all of them were delicate. Strong bonds created in George's solitary world. One morning, a cleaning staff member noticed that George hadn't moved from his corner and curiously approached him. "How are you?" she asked. George smiled with his usual calmness, but this time, there was a deeper look in his eyes. "Good, very good," he replied, but these simple words expressed a peace brought by years, a kind of inner tranquility. After this brief conversation, the cleaning staff member stopped seeing George as just an ordinary stranger. She realized that he was like a silent friend, a cornerstone. Over time, even the rhythm of the train arrivals began to take on a different meaning for George. He was not just a passenger. He had become part of the station's heart. As passengers got off and passed by, George's presence had almost become a ritual. Seeing him was like greeting a new morning. With every new train sound, a new day began, and George somehow felt the rhythm of the station. The trains carried passengers, but George, with every passing moment, shared his story and his presence with them. These silent bonds, initially unnoticed, had created a closeness. The fact that George didn't form deep connections with anyone actually made others feel more connected to him. When people noticed his solitary life, they wanted to give him something, but what was even more interesting was that George needed nothing. He had simplified his life so much that there was no meaning to what anyone could give him. His solitude had granted him a kind of strength. While watching the lives of others, he had filled the voids within himself. Over time, some people at the station began to understand the meaning of his presence. One day, a woman at the ticket counter approached George and asked, "Have you been living here for a long time?" George nodded slightly and answered, "Yes, for years." The woman smiled at George without asking anything further, and in that smile, George found a kind of understanding. He was alone, but this loneliness was transforming into a deeper bond with each passing day. George's loneliness had, in fact, become a source of peace for many people. While everyone moved forward in their own way, his presence became part of the day. A man who did nothing, who didn't participate in anything, could form the strongest connections. Every corner of Gare de Lyon seemed to belong to him. Passengers came and went, but he remained there, always. He had managed to create a connection, to bring meaning, but without explaining it with any words. Every morning, passengers disembarking from the trains passed by like boats along the riverbank, going on their way. But George waited patiently and attentively for each of them. Loneliness was his own, but within that solitude, there was a kind of connection that came to life with the rhythm of the station. George was no longer a stranger, but a secret that the passengers who came and went each morning, every train and every person in every corner of the station noticed, but could never fully explain. In every corner of Gare de Lyon, George's presence carried meaning, coming together in some way. One morning, George's life at Gare de Lyon changed in a way he had never encountered before. When the fire sirens began to sound, George was calmly spending his day in a different corner of the station, as usual. But this time, everything was different. As smoke quickly filled the air, people began running around in panic. Chaos spread across the platforms, corridors, and ticket counters. Panic had intoxicated everyone, and no one could fully understand what was happening. However, George watched the terrifying moment at the heart of the station like an outside observer. Fire had started at the entrance of the station and was rapidly growing. Workers were urgently directing people to safety areas, while all George could think was, "Stay calm." In the chaos, everything was collapsing quickly. People were shoving each other through the smoke, and the sound of fear rose in the air. Yet, George's mental state remained intact. There was no need to fight or give in to chaos. The only thing to do was to understand the situation and stay calm. Instead of hiding in a corner, he slowly began moving, looking for a safe space. George began to move, thinking about how the station's structure was like a labyrinth. Amidst the chaos, he carefully stepped toward the old corner he had grown used to. With each step, he realized there was no feeling of being lost. Instead, there was a sense of security. Living in harmony with the rhythm of the trains for so many years had become his way of survival. Just staying calm was enough. The fire was eventually extinguished, but it left something important behind. Things at Gare de Lyon had changed. Security measures increased, reconstruction work began, and there was a sense of uncertainty in everyone's life. However, for George, this new chaos was actually the beginning of a transformation. He was no longer just a stranger sitting in a corner of the station as he had been in the past. He was now a part of the life inside the station. When people returned to the station after the fire, George continued to exist as a figure they had often ignored or failed to notice but were actually a part of. He moved out of his safe corner in the station and began helping other passengers. Security measures were increased after the fire, but George's calmness and assistance had given him a new responsibility. While others were panicked and lost, George remained calm, almost like a silent leader. One morning, a worker cleaning a corner of the station approached George and asked, "You've been here for a long time, haven't you?" George smiled slightly and just nodded. As always, he was simply there, but he was unaware that something had changed in his life. He had become accustomed to the station. But this fire had taught him something. Connection and security existed not just in buildings, but in people too. In every corner of Gare de Lyon, George had once been merely a stranger, but now he had become part of the station, a figure in it. George's life, with the fire and its aftermath, had opened the door to a new era. He was no longer a lonely man. He had become a figure who could feel the heartbeat of the station, trying to understand this complex world on his own, while also bringing people together. The fire hadn't destroyed him. On the contrary, it had led to his rebirth. This challenge not only kept George alive but also reshaped his identity. Now, everyone at Gare de Lyon, in some way, trusted him and was connected to him as a figure. His return to the station strengthened his calmness, his power, and his bond with the station. The fire wasn't just a disaster, it was a turning point. Gare de Lyon was no longer just a place for passengers disembarking from trains. It had become the place where George rebuilt his identity, where he sought security. He was no longer just a man inside the station's walls, but a figure who had once been lost, now finding a way to exist again. Years passed. But for George, time never seemed to pass the same way as it did before. His life at Gare de Lyon had turned into a cycle since the first day he arrived. Every corner of the station, every wall, had become a part of him. Initially, the tension of being a stranger there had given way to a life lived in harmony. Over time, he hadn't just adapted to the rhythm of the station, but had also claimed its spirit as his own. Every morning felt like the sound of a train, a beginning, a journey. In the moments when the sounds and activity of the station faded into the background, George began to replace the feeling of loneliness he had once gotten lost in with a kind of inner peace. Each new day at Gare de Lyon was like embracing another life. The departure of the trains, the sounds of people, the clinking of the wheels of the waiters' carts, everything had become a part of him. He had not only understood the passengers boarding the trains, but had also grasped the inner workings of the station itself. Every platform, every corridor, seemed not just like space, but a reflection of his own identity. George's life had started with a kind of isolation from the outside world. But over time, this situation had taken on a different form. He had discovered the meaning of existing at the very heart of Gare de Lyon, looking at life from a different perspective. That old loneliness had not been a destruction, but a transformation. Over time, George realized that it was an opportunity. Gare de Lyon had given him the chance to withdraw further from the outside world, but also the chance to form much deeper connections. Now, each train's arrival, each new day's beginning, felt like an opportunity. While people came and went, most did not notice his presence. Or, if they did, they didn't think he had been there for long. However, George had grown accustomed to it. He had started to accept merely existing as a figure. He had left only a trace of himself in the silent flow of his life. Every new train brought him a new thought. Every passenger represented another story, another life. Perhaps, most of all, the depth of this existence came from the understanding that everything was temporary. To feel that everything was exactly where it should be was perhaps the only real truth. One morning, while sitting at a corner in Gare de Lyon, a group of passengers disembarked and briefly greeted George with a nod. He was no longer just a stranger. He had become part of the station. Once, no one had looked at him. But now, people recognized him. A smile, a nod, a short conversation. Everything had gradually turned into a sense of acceptance after all these years. Through all the years George spent in his corner at Gare de Lyon, his life had never completely closed off from the outside world. While he had taken a journey inward, he was in constant interaction with the world around him. The station had become not just a place, but a way of life. George's universe was not just a space constrained within four walls, but a realm where every movement, every sound, touched his life. Over time, understanding the needs of others, helping them, and living in harmony with the rhythm of the station took on more meaning. As he embraced life inside the station, his perspective on the outside world changed. Perhaps the thing George loved most was the rhythm of the station. Every train going somewhere, every passenger heading toward a different life, reminded him of life's continuity. One morning, when the train's departure time came, George smiled as he looked once more. Life truly was in a place where everything passed by, but somehow, it still felt precious. Now, life at Gare de Lyon was no longer just a refuge for George. It had become a source of meaning. Watching the trains come and go every day, he had completely left behind the loneliness he once felt. Slowly, when he lost a piece, he found another world. George had been reborn at the heart of Lion by rediscovering his identity and existence. He had made a new beginning in his life. Loneliness, although it had distanced him from the outside world, had allowed him to create a new connection right here, in the middle of it all. The only thing that truly mattered was his love for life and his understanding of appreciating every moment.